Can I say something about the end of Loki season 2? I think it's misunderstood. Loki at the end of time, holding every branch of the multiverse together with his bare hands. You can see exactly what's happening, but I'm gonna make a prediction that by the end of this video, you're gonna see it just a little bit differently, because there is a difference between a man giving everything up and a man actually setting something in motion, between a sacrifice and a plan. And the difference between these two things is the entire story of Loki. And I actually think it might be the key to understanding what is actually happening in Avengers Doomsday. We've spent 4 videos in this series asking what separates heroes from villains. We talked about the 5 pillars of heroism. We talked about the wound and the war and the moment someone stops fighting it and becomes a villain. We ended last week with a question. What does it actually look like when someone finds their way back? When they go on a journey towards redemption? Loki is the answer, because he's not a hero and he's not a villain. I think he's something the MCU has never really had before. My name is Braden. This is video 5 of my Doomsday Clock series. So let's get into it. Do you guys remember when Mobius sits Loki down and shows him a tape of his entire life? I mean, every humiliation, betrayal, every death just played back at him in a TVA screening room, and he tells him that his function in the multiverse is to lose. Loki, across timelines, in every version of the sacred timeline that he who remains ever allowed to exist, is there to antagonize the Avengers, to push them, to sharpen them, to force them into becoming greater versions of themselves by being the thing they have to overcome. Sit with that for a second. How devastating something like that actually is to hear about yourself. Imagine being shown your entire life, every choice you've ever made, every moment you thought you were building towards something, and the conclusion is that you were simply a tool that made other people's stories more interesting. That is the trickster archetype, by the way, and it goes back thousands of years in mythology. The trickster doesn't win, but they create chaos that forces order to strengthen. And Loki does, at first, exactly what you'd expect. Season 1 is essentially him trying to find the angle where he gets to be the blade instead. The version of events where the story belongs to him. But something shifts, and it doesn't happen in one moment. I think that's what actually makes it so believable, you know? It happens slowly, across 2 seasons, across the time slipping, and the failures, and the centuries of trying to hold something together that keeps falling apart until he decides to stop running. He makes a choice, voluntarily, consciously, with full knowledge of what it costs him. And there is a version of accepting your function that looks like defeat. And then there's a version that looks like wisdom. Finally understanding something true about yourself and walking toward it with your eyes wide open. That's what Loki does at the end of season 2. And that's the whole difference. So last week, we ended the video with a question. We talked about the war, that internal conflict between who you were and what you're becoming, the damaged moral compass that is still sending the signal. And I said Loki lives there for most of his arc, actually, that his story is what the war looks like when someone finally stops fighting it in the wrong direction. So let's actually go there, because Loki was at war for a long time, and there were several times when he almost didn't make it back. In Thor 1, he finds out he's adopted, that everything he thought he knew about himself, his bloodline, his place in Asgard, his right to the throne, was built on a story someone else told him. And the wound that opens in that moment is real. I mean, you look at it and you understand it completely on a human level. So when the war starts, he goes to the wrong side of it fast. In the Avengers, he's telling people to kneel before him. And you can still see it, right? The version of him that could have gone differently. It's just underneath the surface. It's visible if you're paying attention. In Thor 2, he schemes again. And then he dies for Thor because his brother matters more than his survival in this specific moment. The moral compass is damaged, but it still works. In Ragnarok, he's back to his mischievous self at the start, but he finds redemption and he shows up on the Asgardian ship with his brother side by side. And by Infinity War, he hands over the Tesseract, tries to kill Thanos with a knife, which is, completely insane, but it's brave. And exactly what someone does when the war finally stops mattering more than the person standing in front of them. And he dies in a scene that shows the brutal nature of Thanos. And that brings us to the Loki show, where Mobius shows him the tape. So I think Loki watches that tape, and for the first time in his life, he sees himself clearly, not through the lens of everything he was told he was or wasn't, just what he actually is and what he's been all along. And something in him goes quiet. The war doesn't end because he stopped caring. It ends because he finally figures out which side he's actually on. And what comes after that, the ending of Loki season 2, that's what this video is really about. We watch the time slipping in season 2 as desperation. And that's genuinely what's happening on the surface. I mean, he fails a lot. And the show frames it as this exhausting, heartbreaking thing. Somebody running out of options in real time. But the show just cuts forward. Centuries pass, and we just rejoin Loki right before he walks to the throne. We don't see what happened in between. We don't see the full scope of what he actually did with all that time outside of time. And guys, I think that's deliberate. I think he was learning the multiverse. Every version of every hero that had ever existed. And every reality, He Who Remains pruned before it could finish becoming what it was supposed to be. Loki is sitting outside of time, watching all of it. Literally reading it the way you'd read a book you've been given an eternity to finish. And I want you to think about what that actually means. Because every version of Steve Rogers across every possible timeline, every version of Tony, including somewhere out there, the real Victor Von Doom, Loki has seen all of it. And he doesn't prune it or shape it into something he prefers. He just holds it, and he understands it in a way that no character in this universe ever has. And honestly, in a way that He Who Remains never allowed himself to, because He Who Remains was always cutting, always burning away anything that didn't fit in the shape he wanted. But Loki holds everything. And by the time he walks to that throne, by the time he reaches out and grabs those branches, he is taking a position. Because from that throne, outside of time, with every branch of the multiverse visible in front of him, he can actually see what's coming. He can see the incursions, and he can see in those dying worlds the people who are still in them, the best, most tested versions of heroes that ever existed, people from worlds that are about to be gone forever, and he can reach them before they are. Now, there's a title that Loki gets in the comics, Avenger Prime, and I want to be careful here because the comics and the MCU are different things, right? But the concept is worth sitting with. Avenger Prime is essentially this. Loki, having reached the end of his trickster arc, becomes the one who assembles the greatest heroes from across the multiverse because he knows them better than they know themselves. And I want you to think about why that's actually true. Loki has fought the Avengers. He's manipulated them. He has lost to every version of them in every configuration, across more timelines than we can count. And that knowledge, learned through failure and through centuries of watching what actually makes someone rise when everything is falling apart, that makes him the only one who can do this job. And he recruits based on character, on who someone actually is when there is no strategic reason left to keep going. He recruits based on the fifth pillar of heroism, grace. And he has spent an eternity learning exactly where it shows up. And I find something genuinely moving about this. Loki is building something he will never get to be a part of because he cannot leave the throne. If he lets go, the tree falls and everything dies. So he will spend what might be an eternity identifying the best of what heroism looks like across every timeline that ever existed, but he will never fight alongside any of them. He is writing a story that he will never get to read the ending of. At least that's the idea that's presented to us. And I think Deadpool and Wolverine is actually the first time we see this in action, because Deadpool gets pulled from a dying timeline, explicitly told that he is being saved for something that will matter later on in the Sacred Timeline. And I think that is Loki's hand, reaching out from the throne, finding someone in a world that is ending and pulling them forward before it does. That is grace, presented outward, from a man who spent most of his life pointing everything he had directly inward. Alrighty then, let's talk about Steve Rogers, shall we? You know from video 2 of this series that Steve is the variable, the one who makes choices that break every predictive system because he doesn't run calculations. He just does what's right. Steve's choice at the end of Endgame going back, living his life with Peggy, having a child. That is the most personal thing Steve Rogers ever did. The one beautiful, genuinely selfish moment in a life that was almost entirely lived for other people. But here's what Loki can see from the throne that Steve cannot see from that bench by the lake. Steve Rogers, living in the past, existing in a timeline he was never supposed to inhabit for that long, it's quietly doing something to the multiverse. The kind of something the TVA notices. The kind of something that, when left unaddressed, starts to accelerate the very incursions that are already tearing everything apart. But Steve doesn't know this. I mean, how could he? He is just building the life he always wanted. The damage is invisible from where he's standing. And before Loki gets on that throne, I think he knows the TVA is going to go after Steve and prune him. But Loki has looked ahead, and he knows that if this happens, something goes wrong later. Something that needed Steve Rogers specifically. So Loki goes to find him. Think about what that moment looks like from Steve's perspective. The last time he saw this man, Loki was a villain, telling people to kneel. He was the reason the Avengers assembled in the first place. And now he is at Steve's door, different somehow, changed in ways that are hard to put into words. And he has a stern warning for the man at a time that he cannot stay here. The TVA is coming, but that he can move him and his family somewhere safe. And one day he's going to be needed. Why would Steve believe him? Well, I think the answer is simple. I think Loki picks up Thor's hammer. And if that happens, if Loki lifts Mjolnir in front of Steve Rogers, then everything stops. Because Steve knows what that means. He learned it himself in Endgame. He knows it's not something that you perform or earn on technicality. You either are worthy or you are not. And there is no version of the Loki Steve remembers from 2012 that is worthy of that hammer, which means the man standing in front of him is not that Loki, not anymore. So Steve goes with him. That image, if it happens the way I think it might, shows us a man who was always told his function was to make others greater, and doing exactly that, because the multiverse needs Steve Rogers, and Loki is the only one who knows it. Again, that's grace pointing outward. So where does that leave us? Loki on the throne outside of time, watching every branch, pulling people from dying worlds, building something for a war he has already read the beginning of. If you've been paying attention, Loki is the answer to the question we asked at the end of video 4. What does it actually look like when someone finds their way back? When the war goes quiet in the right way? When the moral compass points in the right direction? It looks just like this. A man who was told his whole life that his function was to prop others up, make them better, by losing and choosing that function with full knowledge of what it costs, and then making sure the right people are in the right place when it matters most. And guys, somewhere in the multiverse, there is a man who wants exactly what Loki has: the authorship, the ability to decide which stories get told and which ones end. So next week, we go deep on my boy, Dr. Doom, and we discuss the specific thing that makes him the most dangerous person walking into Avengers Doomsday. And I'm going to predict it is not what most people think it is. I'll see you there.